Yeah, now I want to show you a slideshow that I did. There's many more pictures here than there is in the exhibit, so these are all the key pictures that I created, and I'll do a little narration. Was fighting the Germans. German was the priority. After Pearl Harbor, young Japanese Americans from Hawaii volunteered for service. The Army asked for 2,500 volunteers, and 10,000 young Niseis lined up to join the Army and stood in front of the Iolani Palace for two iconic photographs. Just after the Army said that Japanese Americans would no longer foresee enemy aliens. They would fight for democracy, they would fight for justice, and they would fight for their Nisei parents. This is rare photographs of them getting ready to march down the boulevard and get on the ship, and the first contingent of 1,500 soldiers from the 526th, from the 100th, went to Camp McCoy. The racism on the West Coast was a promulgation of 60 years of racism against all Asians, which started with the worst tragedy of the 20th century, was Executive Order 9066, excluding 120,000 Americans sent from the West Coast, from inland for 500 miles, virtually with no warning, with only a few days to pack up, to be sent to an unknown destination for 3 years. We were first sent to assembly centers, which were old racetracks and fairgrounds where families were put into horse stalls, and then to concentration camps where they had an unknown fate. This is showing the amount of farmland that was owned by Japanese Americans. So the whole area from the West Coast to 500 was designated as a military protected area, and under the rubric of military necessity, which was a lie, 120,000 Americans were removed from their families, their friends, and their community. These were photographs taken by the War Relocation Authority, which was the government agency responsible for interning, the word actually is imprisoning Japanese Americans. Many of these photographs were produced by leading American photojournalists. They were told to prove that the evacuation was not inhumane, that nobody was being mistreated. But the photographers like Clem Alvers and Russell Lee and Dorothea Lange captured the faces, and the tragedy and the dislocation. Many of these photographs that you're seeing were impounded or were censored during the war, and they weren't seen until the 1950s and 60s. Outside of the West Coast, virtually nobody knew this was happening. It really wasn't highly publicized. And unfortunately, there were very few people that protested the forced removal of Japanese Americans. There were some Americans, over 1,000 Americans that I know of, actually protested and actually tried to lobby the government to turn itself around. But American citizens being rounded up by soldiers under a virtual violation of all the protections of the U.S. Constitution, under the rubric of the lie of military necessity. So Japanese Americans had been in the country since 1885, so we're talking over 50 years of accumulated wealth. They lost in a moment, and for many of the first generation Iseis, they were unable to pick up the pieces and were unable to rebuild their lives, unable in their mid-50s to mid-60s to rebuild another life. But they were willing to encourage their children to go into military service. So and you notice that they're wearing their Sunday best clothes. guarded by American soldiers with machine guns pointed in at the camp. Have you seen these photographs before? Anybody has seen them? This is a racetrack in San Francisco called Tanforan, and a lot of families were in the horse stalls where the horses were kept, and they didn't even bother to clean the manure out. The internees had to clean their own horse stalls out. This is a young man and his mother who's turned her back to the camera. Everybody tried to put a happy face on it and tried to smile. And there's an old Japanese saying called shikatagana. Have you ever heard that? It can't be helped. These are the 10 camps, each one holding about 10,000 people in places like Manzanar and Heart Mountain and Gila. Some of them were old Indian reservations. Again, in the most desolate and remote places the government could find. This is Manzanar, Northern California. This is a photograph taken by Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams was hired by the war locator to take photographs, and he wrote a book. He published a book after the war called Born Free and Equal. It's a very interesting series. So after the Army said, we're going to allow you to serve, the Army sent recruiters into the internment camps. And these are the faces of young people being asked to join the military. And they did, by the hundreds. So these are young men volunteering for service from behind barbed wire. Imagine what was going through their mind. They put on their suits, but unknown location, but that location would be called Camp Shelby, Mississippi. So these are the Volunteers for Victory from Topaz, Utah. So almost half of the soldiers who would serve in the 442nd would be either volunteers or draftees from the camps. That's Heart Mountain. This is a touching scene of some Niseis leaving their mother and their children behind. Three brothers who had volunteered for service. 2 brothers who had volunteered for service. And their fathers and mothers said, by the way, this is Sus Ito's mother and father, and they were in Rohr, Arkansas. This is where they were sent to train, in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And it was a segregated camp where Jim Crow laws were enforced in the Deep South. The regimental motto of the 442nd was "Go for broke," which was an old Hawaiian gambling term, which meant give it your all. And when they trained, they set all kinds of training records for physical fitness, for completing marches, for marksmanship. And the whole time, the Army was watching them like a fox, wanted to know that were they going to do a good job. When they went overseas, would they embarrass the Army? When they went overseas, would they prove themselves? But they were instantly, even as they were training, their officers were writing reports and sending to Washington. These young men, their average height was about 5'6", and they weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. That was the smallest man. He was 5 foot. He was 4'9". The commanding officer of the 522nd was Lieutenant Colonel Byra Harrison. And at first, the officers of the 522nd were mostly Caucasian. By the end of the war, about half of the officers were Niseis. So these are photos from albums of the Niseis, of their officers and their training in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And that's Captain Andrews and Captain Feibelman. And it's Chaplain Yamada and Captain Andrews. The officers just loved the men, and the men loved the officers. It was great. And these are the photographs from the album of Chaplain Yamada, who actually kept a wartime diary and his letters. So this is training of the 522nd in the pine forests of Camp Shelby. So they're learning how to dig entrenchments and how to set up cannons. And firing a cannon is a very complex jobs. So the soldiers that were recruited and assigned to the 520, a lot of them were college educated or smart or had an aptitude for physics and math, because firing a cannon is a technical thing. So these are the firing crews. There were 16 cannons in each of the unit, in 4 batteries with 4 rifled cannons each. They fired a shell that weighed a little less than 100 pounds and could fire at about 16 or 17 miles. The 2 men in the front, with the helmets, that's George Oya and Sus Idu, took many of the photographs. This is a chow line at Camp Shelby. The Hawaiians brought Hawaiian culture. In fact, the dominant ethos of the 442nd was established by the Buddha heads from Hawaii. The idea of generosity, of aloha, one for all and all for one. And the spirit of optimism largely came from the Niseis from Hawaii, who hadn't been interned and grew up in a society that was discriminatory, but they weren't the minority and had a different sense of confidence. And they instilled a sense of confidence in their mainland buddies. So when they went home to visit their parents before they went overseas, the mainland Niseis had to go to the camps and visit their parents, still languishing behind barbed wire. And I can tell you how many stories I've read of the soldiers being depressed at seeing how their parents were being treated. So these are signs that were put up in the camps where honoring the soldiers who had volunteered or were drafted from the camp. One of the chaplains of the 442nd said to me, Chaplain Higuchi, when I visited him here in Hawaii in 1980, he said there was nothing sadder that when a Nisei was killed and there was nowhere to bring his body back except to be buried in an internment camp. These are 522nd veterans visiting Jerome, Arkansas, and they were actually horrified. The Niseis from Hawaii had really never seen a camp, so when they saw them, they really understood the prejudice. These are Blue Star mothers in Hart Mountain, and each one of them had 4 blue stars. Each one had 4 sons in the military. If your son was killed, you became a Gold Star mother. So here's an Issei mother writing to her son. And the wives, 3 wives, 3 blue stars, 3 husbands. This is showing a Blue Star flag for all the soldiers who had volunteered from Hart Mountain. That's Amachi, which was in Arizona, 953. So overbroke overseas, and most of these young and teenage Niseis had never been kissed. Were young and innocent. They'd never left the West Coast. They'd never left Hawaii. And they were going to see a wide world and discover how the world worked. And we're going to experience leadership and command and gain a confidence which would serve them well in the post-war. This is a firing battery of the 522nd. This is a sequence of photographs taken by the United States Signal Corps. So these are extremely rare photographs taken by Sus Ito and George Oye of the day-to-day experience. We don't have photographs like this for any other part of the 442nd, where they actually show field photographs that were taken individually. So these are really very interesting. And I can imagine 100 years from now, these will be like Matthew Brady photographs. But we've collected over 4,000 of photographs from Japanese Americans in the big digital archives. And we've interviewed a lot of the veterans, and we hope to preserve the story. And in fact, there's an author in California who has written a book which details the story of the 522nd and the liberation of the Jews in Germany. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team suffered the highest combat casualties of any unit for its size in the war. There was 314% killed were wounded in action, 300% wounded, and 10% killed in action. During World War II, 711 Niseis were killed. Gwen Fujie was asking me, because his father was a wireman, what did he do? These are some of the positions where artillery would do. This is a forward field observer. They would spot where the enemy was with telescopes and binoculars, and they had to plan firing 16, 17. They had to be way out in the front, and the enemy had to be visible, and they would radio the coordinates, and they would fire the cannons. This is extremely high angle, so you would fire the full length. You would fire 16, 17 with accuracy. They could fire 7, 8, 10 rounds a minute. So they were first sent to Italy. Anybody recognize that building? That's the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, and Emperor Trajan's Market in Rome. So they were true Japanese tourists with their cameras taking hundreds of photographs. These are rare photographs of convoys in Italy. And you can see Italy was a mountainous, terrible, terrible war. Italy was really the second front. The war in Northern Europe was the glorious war, but the war in the Mediterranean, which was the idea of Winston Churchill, was to go up the soft underbelly of Europe and climb the boot of Italy and capture the Germans from their underside. And it was a war that was a drudgery war of climbing, using mules, and getting the Germans off the tops of the mountains who had been entrenched up there. And it was drudgery, up and down and up and down. And the army hadn't used mules since the Indian fighting days, and now they were climbing the mountains of Italy. You climb one mountain only to find 10 more mountains in front of you. George Oye in the upper left. There's many of these photographs. And they had an artillery spotter plane. They had an actual small light aircraft that would fly over the enemy positions, and they would radio the positions to the artillery. And the Germans actually feared Japanese Americans, and even Hitler had heard about reports about how terrible the Japanese Americans were inflicting casualties on his units. And the German soldiers, when they encountered the 522nd, called them the Geschreckliche Turkoman, which means the terrible Turks. So they fought for 6 months in Italy, then they were assigned to the 7th Army. And these are the rare photographs I was telling you about of the battle for the rescue of the lost battalion. The 442nd was assigned to rescue 211 men who've been surrounded by the Germans in a forest in central France. And the 442nd rescued 211 men at the cost of 800 casualties on themselves. We had to have some cheesecake. This is how you took a bath in World War II. So now they're going to cross the border into Germany. These are German anti-tank traps, and they're called Dragon's Teeth. So now the 442nd has been separated from the 522nd from their home unit, and they're on their road as a scouting unit. So these are photographs of their advanced unit. So everybody would pile onto these trucks, and they had a truck pulling one cannon and a cannon crew of about 12 men. So this would be, these photographs are April of 1945. They've been in combat for about a year and a half. I've been training for almost 2 years. So when they were advancing to Germany, nobody knew that there were concentration camps. Nobody knew there were murder camps. This is Charlie Battery, C Battery. On the way, they captured a number of German airfields, and some of the airfields had those very rare German prototype jets that were being built. They were the first jets ever built in the history of the world, and they were extremely advanced, and these were captured fields. They were hidden using highways as runways and takeoffs, and they captured 4 or 5 of these enemy airfields. That's Seuss Ito who took many of the photographs. That's a blown-up German bomber. So this is about 20 or 30 miles outside of Dachau. And these are the remnants, the detritus of war. These are the things that they're seeing, blown-up tanks, planes. And the Germans had been defeated. They know they were defeated, and it was just a last-ditch effort just to resist. Hitler ordered, at the end of the war, all of the German cities to be blown up, but his officers didn't And now we're approaching Dachau. We're maybe 10 or 15 miles from Dachau. And nobody had heard the name Dachau. That's a blown up train with an overpass. Just before, there's a sign that says München, which is Munich, 1,000 meters. So Dachau is a suburb of Munich. And Augsburg, they passed through Augsburg, and Augsburg had several small subcamps. And we theorize that some of the subcamps that may have been liberated with small camps with prisoners might have been in Augsburg. Look what the sign says on that. It's Dachau. This is the off-ramp for Dachau. And the date of this photograph is August 29th, 1945. Augsburg, Stuttgart, Karlsruhe, and Dachau, 7 kilometers. So that's less than 10 miles from Dachau. 1,000 meters from Dachau. This is a very important photograph. It shows the Nisei were absolutely within a few minutes of the main camp of Dachau. Some of the Niseis initially thought that they were in the main camp of Dachau, but we absolutely have no proof of that whatsoever, that they went into the main camp or had any experience with it. And I'll talk more about that later. These are some very rare photographs of the hundreds of German prisoners who couldn't wait to surrender to the Niseis. And when they saw the Nisei, they couldn't figure out who they were. And they would ask the Niseis, well, who are you? And they would tease the German soldiers and say, well, we're actually the Japanese army and we surrendered. We're fighting with the Americans now. This is a photograph of one of the subcamps that they liberated with some atrocity photographs. This was taken by Francis Suzuki, who was Sea Battery. And these are actual proof. These are 2 photographs taken by George of Sherman tanks. So they drove around on top of Sherman tanks. And this unit, this tank unit, actually was one of the liberating units of Dachau. Now, these are the most important photographs. These are the photographs of the liberation of the Dachau Death March. And you see the snow in the backdrop. These sets of photographs taken by Susito and George Ollier. These are the photographs that proved inconclusively that the Japanese Americans had liberated this death march and gave them the army and the international credit as liberators of the Allied army. And they were with the 7th Army at the time. This is that big German barn and the farm where they took all the hundreds of prisoners and set up hospital beds and cots and fed them for 2 days. These are the absolute, had these photographs not existed, we could not be here claiming that Japanese Americans were liberated. We wouldn't have had proof without these and the testimony of the Jewish survivors. And Bachkirchen is in the southern tip. That's Sus Ito. Took many of these photographs. Sus is 95 years old. We just had an exhibit honoring him in his photographs at the Japanese American National Museum. Now you notice that their faces are not as happy and as smiling. These are after they've liberated the prisoners. And there's a whole different continent. They've been shaken up. And a lot of them for many years, carried the burden of feeling they couldn't tell the stories to their families and to their children. And Sharkey Kobataki, who was featured in the exhibit, he said to me, Eric, thank you for lifting the stone from my soul and letting me talk about this. I had to talk about it and tell somebody. These are the German prisoners, and they're giving the Heil salute to the Niseis as they're driving through a town. This is the route of Japanese Americans through Germany, and you can see all the towns, Augsburg. It gives you a sense that they were passing within walking distances of a number of the sub-camps. This is Tadashi Tojo. And Tadashi in a tank destroyer unit and crashed through the gate of a camp. This is Sharkey Kobataki, who told me that telling the story lifted the stone from his head. This is Clarence Matsumura, who volunteered from Hart Mountain, Wyoming, who became friends with Sally Ganor. This is Joe Kurata, who was a field commission in Headquarters Battery. These are 2 prisoners who were liberated who wrote a thank you note to Lieutenant Kurata, saying, we thank you for saving our lives and for changing our lives. These are extremely rare and important photographs. At the very end of the war, the Niseis actually had captured Berchtesgaden along with the 101st Airborne Division. And there's Fred Hirayama, who gave me this photograph. And that's Hitler's headquarters at Berchtesgaden. And the war ends, they came home heroes, and they changed America. The 590 laws were gone. They got a Congressional Gold Medal from the United States Congress, the highest civilian award. Japanese Americans were responsible for the redress. The United States government apologized for the internment in 1988. It was the only time the United States government ever apologized for violating the civil rights of Americans and paying reparations. It was the only time that it happened, and it will probably never happen again. And the bill that was signed by President Reagan in 1988 was called House Resolution 442. So the story has an incredible ending, story that you couldn't make up. In fact, in some ways, it reminds me, since we're in a temple, reminds me of the Bible stories that I used to read as a kid of David and Goliath. And the Nisei surely were the David, and the prejudice was the Goliath. And the President of the United States invited the 442nd on July 1946 to come to the White House and to be honored with a Presidential Unit Citation. And they won 8 Presidential Unit Citations. And the President of the United States had a special parade for the Niseis. And it was rare for a president to honor just a regiment, but he knew the history, and he made a speech, and he said one sentence: you fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. So thanks for coming, and thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.